Meow, you guys. This is Mrs. Klein.
Hello, it's Miss Burkles.
We are here with your podcast for lesson 23, The Influence of Neighboring Cultures on Japan. Pay it if you want to follow along on your history book. We're starting off today on page 321.
And our guiding question for this lesson is, in what ways did neighboring cultures influence Japan? And we have our vocab for this lesson: meditation, pagoda, Prince Shotoku, and Shinto.
All right, you guys. The island country of Japan lies just off the eastern coast of the Asian mainland. Japan's culture was enriched by borrowing from other places in Asia between the 6th and the 9th century CE.
Many ideas traveled to Japan by way of the Korean peninsula, but some of these ideas originally came from China and India.
In 593, a female ruler, Empress Suiko, came to power in Japan. Her nephew, Prince Shotoku, admired Chinese and Korean culture and encouraged contact with these mainland countries.
Over the next 300 years, Japan absorbed elements of culture, objects, ideas, and customs from the Asian mainland. As you may remember, the spread of cultural elements is called cultural diffusion. In this lesson, you will learn how cultural diffusion with India, China, and Korea helped to shape medieval Japanese culture, including its language, art, architecture, and music. You will discover how Japanese blended ideas from other cultures into their own unique civilization.
All right, moving on to section 1, you guys, cultural influences on Japan. By the time Empress Suiko and Prince Shotoku came to power in 593, cultural influences from the Asian mainland had been reaching Japan for hundreds of years. For example, craftspeople from the Korean peninsula had brought knowledge of bronze casting and advanced ironworking to Japan. However, as Suiko, Shotoku, and later rulers sought out contact with the mainland, the pace of cultural diffusion quickened.
Japan, in Empress Suiko and Prince Shotoku's day, was a rural agricultural society. Japan at this time was far from being a unified country. Power was divided among chiefs of a number of clans called Yuji. Under Suiko, Shotoku, and later rulers, the government of Japan took an active interest in Korean and Chinese culture. Sometimes knowledge of mainland culture came from Japanese who traveled to China.
Sometimes it came from Korean workers who settled in Japan, bringing their knowledge and skills with them. During the next 3 centuries, Japan sent officials, students, translators, and monks on ships across the sea to China.
As a result of these contacts, the Japanese acquired new ideas in government, the arts, architecture, and writing. The Japanese did not just change their old ways for new ways, however. Instead, they blended new ideas with their own traditions to create a unique culture.
All right, section 2, government imitating the Chinese system. Starting with Prince Shotoku, Japanese rulers adopted new ideas about government from China. The emperor in China was the sole ruler, whereas in Japan, the emperor had only loose control over the semi-independent Uji.
While Japanese emperors depended on local leaders, the Chinese emperor ruled with the help of a bureaucracy of government officials. During the 7th and 8th century, Japanese rulers adopted a Chinese style of government.
Later rulers went much further in bringing Chinese-style changes to Japan. By the 700s, Japan's imperial government looked much like China's. It was strongly centralized and supported by a large bureaucracy.
Section 3, City Design, Adapting Chinese Ideas for a Magnificent City. In 710, the imperial government built a Chinese-style capital on the site of the modern city of Nara. The new city was a smaller version of Chang'an, China's capital. There was one major difference between the two capitals. Chang'an was surrounded by a wall as protection against enemies, and Nara did not have a wall.
All right, section 4, religion. Buddhism comes to Japan. Nara's Buddhist temples were another result of cultural diffusion. Japan's original religion was Shinto. This religion expresses the love and respect of the Japanese for nature. Instead of emphasizing a code of morality, Shinto stresses purifying whatever is unclean, such as dirt, wounds, and disease. Most of all, however, Shintoists celebrate life and the beauty of nature.
In contrast, Buddhists see life as full of pain and suffering. To escape this cycle, one must follow a moral code called the Eightfold Path, which emphasizes showing respect for others, acting rightly, and achieving wisdom through meditation.
You guys probably remember a little bit of that from last year in 6th grade when you did your unit on India and Buddhism. The influence of Chinese culture brought Buddhism to Korea. Mahayana Buddhism arrived in Japan in 552 when a Korean king sent the Japanese emperor a statue of the Buddha and a recommendation for the new religion.
After a fierce controversy, the emperor and his court adopted the new religion. Buddhism did not replace Shinto. Instead, both religions thrived and even blended.
All right, moving on, you guys, to section 5, writing, applying Chinese characters to the Japanese language. Ancient Japanese was only a spoken language. The Japanese had no writing system of their own. That's kind of familiar. Like we learned about that when we were studying Africa, right? There was no written language until Arabic came. First, Japanese scholars began using kanji or Chinese writing to write Japanese words. By 900, the Japanese invented kana, which means borrowed letters in Japanese. In kana, simplified Chinese characters represent Japanese syllables. Both kanji and kana are still part of written Japanese.
So cool. Section 6, Literature Adapting Chinese Poetic Form. The earliest literary works in Japan were poems that date from the 7th and 8th centuries. Using Chinese characters, Japanese poets developed a form of poetry called tanka.
And then we're moving on, you guys, to section 7, Sculpture, Carving Techniques Travel to Japan. Like Buddhism, new techniques and subjects of sculpture came to Japan from Korea and China. Meanwhile, Buddhism was inspiring new subjects for sculptures on the Asian mainland. As these ideas moved east, sculptors' techniques and materials gradually changed.
From the middle of the 6th century to the middle of the 7th century, Chinese and Korean immigrants created most of Japan's religious art. Japanese artists learned new techniques from them.
All right, section 8, Architecture, Adapting Temple Designs. New forms of temple design came to Japan from India by way of China. In India, Buddhist monasteries featured shrines called stupas with roofs shaped like bells or inverted bowls. The Chinese replaced the bell shape with a series of stories and curved roofs, creating structures called pagodas.
When Buddhism arrived in Japan, the Japanese adopted the pagoda design. Section 9, Music, Adopting New Ways and New Music and Instruments. Japan's native music consisted of chanted poems, war songs, folk songs, and Shinto prayers. As contacts with the Asian mainland increased, the Japanese imported music from the region, especially from China. Gagaku, a form of Chinese court music, arrived in Japan in the 6th century.
New kinds of music required new musical instruments. One of the most interesting was a wind instrument the Chinese called a sheng, which the Japanese called a sho.
Okay, for our lesson summary. In this lesson, you learned how from the 6th to the 9th centuries, Japanese acquired and adapted elements of other Asian cultures, creating a unique civilization.
All right, cultural influences on Japan. Objects, ideas, skills, and customs flowed to Japan from India, China, and Korea, encouraged by Prince Shotoku and other early Japanese rulers.
Government and cities. From China, the Japanese borrowed the idea of a strong central government supported by a bureaucracy. To house the imperial government, they built a new capital modeled after China's capital city.
All right, religion. Buddhism, which began in India, came to Japan from China by way of Korea. Buddhism strongly influenced Japanese religion, art, and architecture.
Writing and literature. Koreans introduced Chinese writing to Japan. The Japanese invented kanji and kana to write Japanese words and sounds with Chinese characters. Poets used Chinese characters to write tanka, a type of poetry based on Chinese models.
All right, sculpture, architecture, and music. Like Buddhism, ideas about sculpture traveled from India to Korea and China, and then to Japan. Similarly, India's stupas inspired Chinese pagodas. Japan then adapted this architectural style. New kinds of music, such as gagaku, and instruments came to Japan from China.
All right, you guys, that wraps up lesson 23, the influence of neighboring cultures on Japan. Our guiding question is, in what ways did neighboring cultures influence Japan?
All right, don't forget about those vocab words: meditation, pagoda, Prince Shotoku, and Shinto.
Have a great day.
Toodles.